Anyway, I appreciate you getting us started, Sophie, for this webinar. You know, I had an opportunity to do this presentation one other time. It did not get recorded, so I'm pretty excited about the fact that I get a chance to do it this time. And the premise of this entire presentation lies on the fact that we all have a challenge in the war for talent. In essence, we're trying to figure out what it is that we need to do to continue to maintain our dominance, or at least try to get back into the good graces of the industry through talent. And I was thinking about putting some really fancy picture here and putting all sorts of interesting statistics on it. But I thought if you're attending this, most likely you know that there's an issue. So I'm not going to waste my time or your time around trying to give you a bunch of statistics that you probably already know. So let's dive in to a perspective or a view on what we can do with the war for talent. So as I was preparing for this particular webinar and this presentation, I was trying to figure out what would be a really good angle for us to take a look at in the improvement of our entire organization. I think there's lots of ways of doing it. There's lots of good webinars, lots of great speakers out there. But in this particular case, I thought I would start with what's called the evaluation view. So there's a professor out of the MIT School of Business. His name is Eric Bjorsenfolk. It's a Dutch name. And he's really big on looking at companies more from sort of a computer and IT perspective. And so this is his lens that he views an entire valuation of a particular company. And he kind of breaks it down into these three buckets. Basically, there's IT capital, right? So the computers and servers and all the stuff that we all need nowadays in the year 2017 to make our companies work. Then we have this idea of technological complements. What that is whatever industry you're in, you probably have some kind of machinery, right? Whether it be some kind of manufacturing machinery to make pills or maybe even automobiles or whatever that is. And that probably composes of 15% of your entire cost of the valuation of the company. But then there's this big chunk, this 75%. It's broken down into three major areas. Intangible assets such as human capital, of course, that's the talent we're talking about today. Business process, right? So over a period of time, you invested money and resources in these business processes to make sure that they run smoothly. And lastly, believe it or not, you can this idea of evaluating your culture. The fact remains is that there's many companies out there that you can Google. Zappos is, for example, one that comes to mind, that actually you can monetize your culture, that one that actually having a culture within that industry actually generates more money than you would if you didn't have it in some other industry. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about that 75%. And so to make it real simple for everybody to write down and jot down some ideas as I go through this, I gave you the 3 C's, this idea of collaboration, culture, and compensation, right? So I'm going to take these intangible assets and I'm going to run those down a step at a time. And I'll be talking about a bunch of different things here in the next few minutes. So I would suggest right now that you take out that fountain pen and that piece of paper and be ready to take those notes. All right, let's get started, which I believe is the most important part of this, is culture. I think it's one of those things that many companies, especially here in the life sciences arena, really take for granted. It's one of those things that sometimes people don't think it's measurable or that is difficult to pin down, but the fact is it's a very real phenomenon and something that we should discuss. And I love this quote by Peter Drucker that basically says, look, whatever your culture is going to eat whatever strategy you come for breakfast. People try to strategize their way out of culture. They try to avoid it, minimize it, even ignore it. And the fact remains is you can't do any of the above. You have to face it. Arguably, you need to embrace it. So what I like to do now is break that down as we move forward. Oh, yeah, there's this other slide that I want to bring up, too. It was interesting. As I was getting prepared for this particular presentation, I go through a lot of these different reports. And this one actually came from LinkedIn. I think it was not even like a month ago. And I found it really interesting, kind of caught my eye because that's where my head was at around creating this presentation around culture. And look at this. Recruiters basically say, what do you think attracts candidates for your company? Number one is company culture, and then in turn, your candidates are saying, what information would be helpful considering your potential employer? Sure enough, it's culture. So not only your recruiters or companies, as I'm kind of categorizing them in this particular slide, as well as candidates are literally looking to the same thing. So arguably, we could say it's probably a pretty important topic that we should address. So now let's take a pause here for a second and say, you know, there's a lot of different cultural frameworks in place that you could probably measure your culture in your organization. I chose this one specifically for two very good reasons. This particular framework, number one, is a very interesting and measurable and what I would call malleable, the ability to create interventions to actually move those forward and change those. And the second reason is because it was, you know, my academic hero that actually created this, Dr. Edgar Schein. There's a selfie with me and Dr. Schein in one of our conferences. A very interesting man. He kind of wondered why I wanted to take a picture with him, but I think he got over it. Anyway, so let's get back to the cultural framework. So what I want to do is break down each one of these pieces and talk about what they actually mean. Let's start at the top and move our way down. There's a reason I'm doing this. So the first piece of this cultural framework is what we call artifacts. Now, what are artifacts? Well, if you think of it from an anthropological perspective, artifacts are those things that are laying around. You walk around, you see things. In this case, you know, if you were to wonder whether or not, you know, what kind of beverages potentially somebody drinks, you would take a look at their table and see what they're pouring, and you would be able to try to figure out, well, you know, they like soda, right, because they see it on the table. Those are artifacts. Now, what's important about artifacts is we tend to drive conclusions of those artifacts. We tend to view the world in such a way that those artifacts are telling me something, and I got to tell you something. Usually, you're wrong with doing that. They're very, very hard to decipher, and so it's very misleading when you're looking at artifacts, and you'll see how this has a lot to do with talent management here in a second. Let me just run down these few of these. The next is these espoused values. These espoused values underneath these artifacts are the strategy, goals, and philosophies. Like, how do you actually run your organization? Some of these strategies may be written on a piece of paper. Some of these may just be passed down through tribal knowledge. Nevertheless, there's these strategies on how you actually believe you can make an impact in the industry. And then lastly, and probably the most difficult one for us to decipher, is what's called basic underlying assumptions. These are unconscious, take it for granted beliefs, perceptions. The idea here is that over a period of time, through policies and procedures, and as well as unintended consequences from those policies and procedures, we land on a set of assumptions of what we believe. Now, what's interesting about this cultural framework is obviously each one of these things influences the next. And the major sort of takeaway out of this section here is just because you change one of these doesn't necessarily mean that it will ripple and change something else in the cultural framework. So let's get a little more specific when it pertains to life sciences. So what might be some artifacts in the life sciences world? Well, policies, procedures, and quality systems just come to mind, very generic, right? What are policies, right? It's those things, it's those documents or maybe machinery out there that adheres to some kind of direction for that particular company. Procedures, how do I actually enact those policies? People are trained. So I can see a lot of this happening, but what's interesting is we don't necessarily know, even though many of us assume we know by looking at this, why these policies and procedures are in place. So what might be an espoused value? An espoused value specifically in life science might be what's called second-person validation, right? This idea that how do I maintain my error margins down? How do I make sure that the quality systems are up to the tolerance we're looking for? Well, I might institute second-person validation. Though initially that may sound like a procedure, it really isn't, because I have to buy in that that's a valuable thing, meaning that that second person that might be validating what I'm doing, they have to be well-versed in my particular area of interest or how it actually would solve that problem. And then lastly is this idea of basic underlying assumptions. And in this case, something like accountability is very big in the life sciences world. Now, arguably, that accountability may be driven by the external factors as it pertains to just different policies and procedures that may come from the government, suggesting that we have to be accountable for the things we do. Now, the question is, do we embody that accountability in our organization? Do we actually believe that we have to be accountable? I would say for the most part, given the rigors of life sciences, that accountability is very true. Mind you that I'm just giving you some examples here, but now taking a step back and looking at the framework holistically, you can potentially take a look at this and say, you can now see how one can connect to the other. For example, if I did not necessarily believe that I was accountable, meaning I didn't make that assumption, then potentially that second person validation or that value that I hold dear to me may not necessarily be that important, which in turn ripples into the artifacts themselves. Maybe I'm going to be less rigorous about my policies and procedures. Maybe I'm going to be lackadaisical in how I actually execute those things. So you can see how it has a ripple effect. Now, hopefully you sort of picking up on the fact of, well, if I want to change, where would I actually change this? Let's give you a particular case study. And this comes from the life sciences industry itself. For those that may remember Ciba-Geigy. Ciba-Geigy is a company that was around for 250 years. They're based out of Europe. If you remember now its history, it actually merged with Sandoz and to become Novartis. But what I find very interesting in this particular case study is it was around for so long, and all of a sudden it had to merge through business pressures and actually became yet another company. So can we attribute what happened to them through maybe a dysfunctional cultural problem that occurred over time? Let's take a quick look. So the case study starts something like this. It used to have a beautiful headquarters. I believe it was in Switzerland. You walk into the front door. There was a lobby. It was well lit. Somebody really was there to greet you. And then you walk into the offices. And it was very interesting was when you walk down this one hall, lots of offices on both the right and the left side. All these doors were closed. There's no windows. Doors were closed. But above each of the door thresholds was a light. And the light had three states. It could be turned off, it could be green, or it could be red. So turned off means the person's not in the office. Mind you, all the doors are closed. So turned off light means nobody's in the office. Green means, sure, go ahead and knock, I'll answer. And red means, I'm in here, but please don't knock because I'm busy. So there you have it. That's an artifact. You can view that artifact, and then you can start figuring out, okay, well, what's this artifact tell me? We went deeper into this case study, and you find out that the value was that only real work was done alone. These were all highly paid physicists and scientists and engineers and whatever else they had there to do the work that they were doing, and the value was to work alone, to think about what you were doing. And the only discussions that were valuable were what we call vertical ones, right? Meaning my boss or my subordinate. That's all I needed. I just told my boss what I was doing, or I told my subordinate what I wanted them to do. So there was very little collaboration or communication, right? Because there was no value to it. So what was the assumption underneath all of that? So there's always enough time for quality, meaning that quality is going to be driven by me sitting alone and thinking about those problems. And it did have a sense of family in this particular, but it was a hierarchical family, meaning parents and children, right? So children must obey, and in this case, subordinates, and the boss was the mom and dad, and they told you what to do, and that was pretty much the only way you collaborated across all of that. So what was the problem? Well, the CEO and the rest of the C-level organization, they wonder, well, how come we don't have any collaboration going on? Now, you might be laughing behind your muted phone, but this is very true. they couldn't understand it. They had this wonderful, beautiful office. Everyone had their own offices. You would think people would be able to come in. Actually, we had little lights telling people when to come and go, and you would think that would generate some kind of connection, but it never really did. And so what would you then do to actually fix this particular issue? I'm going to pause there for a second and just have you think about, here you have, I'll make you the organizational development specialist, right? Here you have an issue of this culture, and the problem before you is, how do I actually make, or not necessarily make, but how do you actually induce collaboration? How do you actually change that? Do you remove the doors? Do you get greater levels of conference rooms? This is what the reaction is around these, is that you would go and change the environment. But then now that you've kind of given you and pulled the curtains from this particular framework, now that I've given you this idea, do you really think that more conference rooms or would actually give people a better view of things? I'm going to say that it wouldn't. It's not until you really start working your way down the stack here and get to the underlying assumptions and use them to your benefit here. Start looking at what the value is. You've got to move the value from this individual view over to a collaborative view. You have to change the way that the perception that quality, though there is enough time, actually can be born through collaboration. So we're not going to solve this problem because arguably now that we have history on our side, the problem didn't get solved. But it's one for us to think about as we move forward. So let's give you some overall recommendations outside of that particular case study. So the first thing we want to do in this particular culture framework is take a look at metrics and goals. They do not represent the company culture, right? Observation really is going to represent the culture. A lot of times people try to move the metrics forward in such a way that it will represent some kind of cultural benefit. And in this case, you have to take a look at things like, what are your doors in your company? What are your little lights above those doors? What, from a metaphorical perspective. Culture cannot be understood with looking at the core technologies, right? So again, people tend to move to those artifacts, and let's not be more appropriate to say things along the lines of talent management. So again, now that I've given you this perspective, pop quiz out there, right? If I were to buy an LMS, would that make me a learning organization? Probably not. Not until you dealt with some of those values and underlying assumptions. Unfortunately, that's the thing that everybody sees. And so they believe that, you've made it into that world. And that's just not necessarily the case. And then lastly, I do want to make a little statement about what's called national cultures. And in this case, we are a global economy, right? The world is shrinking. Technology is shrinking that economy. What makes this very important for us to understand is, even though we are becoming a global economy, nationality, race, color, creed, religion, all of that still is a major piece of the cultural fabric that you will find within an organization. It needs to be dealt in a different but parallel way, and I don't necessarily mean to include that discussion in this particular presentation, but I certainly would be remiss in not at least stating that up front. So hopefully that gives you a perspective on how to actually analyze cultural framework. Mind you, this is a career for somebody, right? This is a very deep subject, but hopefully I can demystify some of that as we move forward. So that's our first C, culture, which arguably is probably the most important one out of all of this, because you'll see how culture creates the environment for the other two C's to actually flourish as we move forward. The next one I want to talk about is collaboration. And in this case, I want to start with this quote, not because it's pithy or it's because some kind of intellectual value, but it really does have a perspective here. It says we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. This is very important because often what we see is, for example, if we believe that there is a learning problem with our particular learning system, we tend to then turn around and say, oh, it must be this artifact, and therefore we need another artifact to change it. And now that we've got some language between us, me and the audience here on the phone, you can see how that's just not necessarily the case. The fact here is that we have to look deeper. So let's take a look at how collaboration actually helps us in the war for talent. So I consider this how it actually represent culture, a collaboration in this particular situation. And so I thought I would start with what's called this group structure. Very, very simplistic. So if you take any organization and you slice it, right, you're going to have basically 3 buckets of things here. You're going to have members, which are the people. You're going to have tasks, what the people do, and tools, what the people use to do those tasks. And that itself is a consideration for a group structure. Now, by itself, doesn't seem like you're really doing anything or actually moving the needle. This seems pretty trivial. However, if you consider the intersections between each one of these from a relation perspective, in this case, I'm going to call these coordination networks, this is really when you start thinking about how you can optimize your collaboration. So let me run these down real quick, and then let's dive into one of them, each one. So in essence, basically, there are 6 of these types of coordination networks, right? Member network, right? The member-to-member relationship, very simple. What's one person related to another person, whether it be some kind of functional relationship, whether in the same organizational bucket, maybe they're in marketing or in sales. Task network, right? There's a task-task relationship. Usually the minute you start talking about task-task relationships, you're now talking about projects and larger business initiatives as they aggregate. Tool network, how does one tool work with another tool? So you have these relationships inside each of these circles. And I think those are important to consider. But what I want you to take a look at is, let's consider those intersections. In this case, we can talk about the labor networks, right? So these are people doing tasks. Now we're getting a little deeper, right? So you've got potentially marketing people doing marketing tasks, the product development people doing product development tasks. And how is that relationship put together? The next one is role network, right? Member and tool relationship. So does the member, the person, understand how to utilize their tool for that particular task? And then lastly, this task-tool relationship. What's interesting about this one is, do I have the right tool for the right task? Sometimes I'm given the wrong tool, or at least, let's say, less than optimal tool to do that task. So as we consider these, let's move forward and take a look at specific life science issues as it pertains to each one of those. So in the member network, I might have people that are in quality or manufacturing and tech services, and they have a relationship to each other. So imagine, if you will, these 3 circles inside each one of these circles, and you can just keep going deeper, deeper, and deeper. What I'm hopefully giving you a perspective is decomposing the collaboration so you can have specific areas of issues. I'm going to tell you that the 80-20 rule applies here very, very strongly, meaning that 80% of your collaboration is really going to come from 20% of this structure. And it's either going to come from that structure, or maybe it's going to be inhibited by that structure, right? So if you can outline exactly where those issues are, you'll be able to fix them. Sometimes people feel like you have to have a big overhaul in a collaborative world, which, by the way, leads me to a discussion around culture, right? Next thing you know, it's like, well, we're not collaborating, and therefore, we need a collaboration tool. Yeah, that's that artifact all over again. So you can see how these 2 culture and collaboration start working together. So let's go through each one of these and just give you some examples. The next might be tasks, right? I have a task to document, I have a task to run trials, I have a task to design and develop things. Again, I can have that relationship within that circle, or I can also talk about the relationship between. Are the right people doing the right tasks? See, now the next conversation you could potentially have here is talking about training, talking about competencies. If I see that that labor network, which is the member-task relation, is the weakest part of this, the challenge may be then, maybe I need to retool people, or maybe I need to change my operating procedures. You know, again, we're defining something that's much more granular, have the ability to create the intervention for greater levels of optimization. And then lastly, this idea of the tools, right? What kind of equipment and what kind of procedure or policies, tools do I have that allow me to maintain those, make sure that everyone's got the latest version? And again, are they the right ones, especially if I'm talking about the job network, when the task and tool relationships may be out of sync. So what are we going to do about this? Here's some recommended actions, and this is arguably what I do with many of our customers today, is you have to have alignment between these three areas. I think that's the first thing. Let's not worry so much about the quality of these as much as, do I really have alignment, and do I have the right things connected to the right people and the right tasks? And the best way to do this is through going through these 5 steps, making sure you have a vision and a mission. Now, in this case, a vision and mission are specific to collaboration initiatives. Often when I talk to customers and I use the term vision and mission, their eyes roll. They say, no, Tom, that's just, that's lofty executive stuff that's really not very useful. I'm going to tell you right now that I believe that the vision and mission are probably the most underutilized management tools that you have today. So I'm going to give you a quick little operational definition of each. Maybe it'll help you. So when you're constructing a vision, and I'm talking in this case at some project levels, some initiative level, the question you want to ask yourself is, what does the world look with or without you, or with or without this project? Right? The idea here is you should be able to have a vision, I use air quotes here, a vision of what the world would look like. What do I see? What are things happening? What are people doing and talking? And then the question would then become, what would have to be true for that vision to exist? Right? So it's very pragmatic, and I think sometimes, management consultants all over the world, I think we've done a disservice when it comes down to having a discussion around vision and mission. Next would be the mission. And the mission would be, what slice of effort are you going to put forward on the vision? So let's say the vision is grandiose. I love using the Susan G. Komen vision, which is very simple. It's like a world without breast cancer. There you have it. You can count it, you can see it, you can measure it. So then the question becomes, what has to be true for that to occur? And they decided their mission would be to fundraise research for that. There's probably a whole bunch of ways to get to that vision, but that's the slice of effort that they chose. Very, very clear, very impactful, and it's also very tangible and concrete, not abstract, so the people that are buying into the vision and mission know exactly what they need to do to make that happen. From there, you then have the strategy and goals, right? So what are the steps I have to do to be able to place that mission, to make that mission true? The execution model, when has to go first, a lot of planning. And then the thing I always end with is the adjustment. I do a lot of change management work for a lot of different customers and prospects, and I'm going to tell you, in my observation and in my experience, the number one reason why people kind of shy away from a more rigorous change management process is because they have to come to the realization that something might go wrong. And it's a very hard realization to have. Nobody wants their project or their initiative to have a mishap. But I got to tell you that all of the ones I've ever been involved, and that includes all the successful ones, usually have something that's unforeseen. So you have to allow and give yourself a little grace to make those adjustments. The minute you have that mindset, all of a sudden you can start rolling this out and be much more successful. So that's the collaboration, the three-step, the sort of the three areas dissected, and then some next action to be able to make sure that all of these three areas are aligned. Okay, so we talked a little bit about organizational culture. That would be the environment. Then we've got collaboration. That would be how the people and tasks and tools work within the environment. You see how I'm putting all this stuff together. And lastly, there's this thing called compensation. Now, immediately people gravitate to how much I get paid. Yep, that's a piece of it. But there's a little more than just that. And I want to start with this quote from William Barclay. It says, "We will often find compensation if we think more of what life has given us and less about what life has taken." It's kind of that glass half full, half empty. And I would suggest that if you look at compensation in that manner, especially within management and leadership ranks, and start looking at what exactly do people want out of their particular roles. So the first thing I want to do is talk about these two compensation considerations. I find this very interesting. If you really do the analysis, the first thing, the sort of first statement I want to make is merit increases do not reward merit. Now that seems kind of a counterintuitive, but it really, if you think about it, right, it really doesn't. You have a whole sorts of different people working in your organization, and you have different connections, you have different qualities, different needs, wants, and yet you're trying to sort of scale some kind of reward merit system across all that. So you can see the disparaging connections there. You can see how they're not going to be aligned, right? Usually it's based on some institutional budget, right? So at the end of the year, the company did X. We've all decided that everyone's going to get 3.5%, and off it goes. So next thing you know, you're like potentially doing better than your neighbor, if you will, from a performance, and you're getting pretty close to what they're doing, if not the same thing. So what are you really doing there? Is it really about the money? Probably not. It's going to be, it's more of a morale issue at that point. And especially when you start talking about when merit is frozen. It's usually across the board. It's not, you know, just a certain part of the organization or anything along those lines, right? So all of a sudden it's like, oh, it doesn't really matter what I do. Because it's all going to be based on what the company does. So all of a sudden we're talking about money, but we're really not talking about money, right? Because we're talking about morale and all this other stuff that goes with it. Let's move over to variable pay. So variable pay, my opinion is, right, is the merit pay, right? This idea that I can now, depending on your current performance, and be able to jockey, if you will, the amount of money that you're making based on, so now it's a realization of what you're actually doing. And you now see the money grow when you do well, or at least what you're expected to do, or not as much when you're not doing what you expected to do. So you're now relaying that message. Now, mind you, I'm talking about money and pay and merit increases and all that, but listen to what I'm saying between the lines. This has little to do with money and more so about what messages do I want to send out. So let me make this a little even more clear. This is a typical something that I pulled down from the internet that you can find anywhere, by the way. All the stuff I've talked about is certainly readily available, and may I strongly suggest you go out there and see this for yourself. But let's take a look at just the standard calculation here, right? So here we go, right? We have a merit increase. We're going to give somebody, we got our budget, it's 3%. And we take a look at this and say, okay, here's an average performer, top performer. They both make the same money, $50,000. The average performer gets 3%. The top performer, he gets a whopping 4.5%. Here's your annual increase calculated. That's increase per pay period. You then take some taxes out. You look all the way to the bottom right, and your top performer out of from your average performer is making another $22 a pay period. Now, let me tell you, how would a top performer feel about that out of a $50,000 raise to say, you're my top performer and this is how much you're worth? And the answer is probably not very, very good about it. But that's my point on this whole thing, is really trying to understand compensation as it pertains to employee engagement and morale. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this. I spend a lot more time on employee engagement and employee satisfaction on other webinars, and I strongly encourage everybody to go out to the YouTube. The Cornerstone has a channel on YouTube. You can do employee engagement, and there's plenty of webinars that talk about that. But this is a slice of this particular view on war on talent, is taking a look at the monetary side and really what happens when it comes down to what I would consider the non-monetary side. All right, so what are some compensation recommendations that I've given in the past to actual clients? I mean, first you could start by eliminating merit increases together. Or in this case, I would suggest maybe even relabeling it, right? Don't call merit increases a merit that everyone's going to get, or maybe you just dump that. Maybe it's a cost of living. If it's going to be 3% across the board, then call it, say, hey, look, the company did so well that we're going to give everybody 3%, or call it cost of living, right? Because we're talking at this more engagement level, I think it's important for us to understand that it's not really about the numbers, but it's more about the sentiment and the feeling behind it. So if we can relabel it, we may actually be able to make our point better. Variable ratings, right? Again, develop compensation ratings based on the compa ratios, right? Achievement of goals. That actually drives the payouts, right? There's a discretion button, right? All of a sudden you have a lot more flexibility and be a lot more nimble. What about the one person that has achieved for you for the last 10 years and had a bad year, right? In whatever performance model you've used, maybe this is an opportunity to say, look, you had a tough year, but we really recognize you should be able to do that. And because we're talking about people, and we're talking about their self-worth and their value. We're not talking about machines here. So those right there are some of my compensation recommendations. And so as we close out, I have just a summary slide here, and then we'll start taking questions. I think, remember that culture is very observed. It's observed in the sense that we saw those artifacts, but we really have to understand where those artifacts come from the values and the assumptions underneath. Collaboration. We have all these parts moving, but we aggregate them into those three things. We're talking about members, tasks, and tools. How are they all aligned for optimization in the war for talent? And lastly, we want to make compensation appropriate, right? We want to make sure that if you're working for a certain performance, we're going to pay it accordingly. But if we're working for an organizational goal, then you should get paid appropriately. And with that, I pause for any questions that might be out there.
Thank you, Tom. For those in the audience, if you'd like to ask questions, you can use the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen.
So I got a question that just came in, and sure enough, this is probably the question I get all the time. We go back to the cultural thing, and I had a question about somebody asking me to be more specific on how we actually can move the culture change. And so the best way I can do this at this point is to give you an example. I had a particular customer that was having a hard time with performance management, performance appraisal issues. And basically the culture of that was this was a boring, worthless activity that takes a lot of our time with very little payback. And so as I tried to discover what the value was and then the associated assumptions was, well, the only reason that we do these things is because we want to stay off the list. Now, everybody knows the dreaded list, right? The list that says you didn't do performance appraisal, and so your boss sends out, so then you just do it. And that became the value, stay off the list. And so I said, well, what goal do you actually want to do? And the goal was, we don't want to lose talent. That's the reason we're doing performance appraisal. So I said, what if you do this? What if instead of putting people on a list for performance appraisal misses, why don't you put people on the list for losing talent? And of course, people got a little freaked out about that because it's different, it's change. But if you think about it from an organizational perspective, if people want to stay off the list and that's the value behind it, why not put something that truly is valuable, like losing talent? So what started to happen when we instituted this, mind you, now this is temporary. What we're trying to do is, that's not where we want the organization to stay, right? What steps we want to form one that actually retains talent and makes it, an exceptional organization to work for. So what happened was people, well, I don't want to be on the list to lose talent. What are the things I need to do to keep my top performers? Hey, guess what? Have more current performance appraisals, have them quarterly, give them feedback. So all of a sudden, the consequential benefits of this kicked in. And how did we do that? Well, the artifact is still the performance appraisal. Arguably, that really didn't change. What we really change is where do we actually point the value and the basic assumption of being on that list, right? So the performance appraisal is still the same process, still all that. Arguably, it's now seen to be in a more positive way, and people seem to gravitate. So that was a really good question. Okay, I've got another question that just came in. And somebody wants me to go back and review the discussion around vision and mission. Yeah, so again, I can't reiterate this enough. I personally believe that the whole exercise on creating vision and mission statements is a very underutilized management tool. I would personally suggest that many of the vision and mission statements that I see for very large organizations are poorly crafted and really are just inconsequential. They just sit there, right? Nobody's really gravitating to it. So let me go back and go through that again. So again, the idea around here is vision is what do I see when I am successful in what I want to do. I talked a little bit about Susan G. Komen, there is eradication of breast cancer. I think it's one way to see it in the sense of sort of abstract and philosophical. A whole other way to say, look, it's very accountable, very measurable, very apparent, right? The artifact here is tests, if you will, or basically having no breast cancer to speak of. And so the question is, if that's the vision, right, this is what I see, what is the mission? And the mission, again, is that slice of effort to make that vision successful. Arguably, there's lots of different organizations out there that would suggest, hey, look, that's the eradication of breast cancer is something that we all want to do, but maybe they're taking a different tack. Maybe there are some health sciences organizations out there that are saying, early detection, right? So now what we want to do is make sure that, every woman and men, have the appropriate, mammogram at the right time. So that would be their slice or their effort of their mission. So how would they make that happen? And so my suggestion is you push vision and mission as a management tool down into the organizations and down almost into the individual. I can tell you, and I don't want to get too much into this, but I personally have a vision and mission statement for my life. And I'll tell you, what makes it really interesting about that is that it makes my decision-making much easier, right? So I'm going about life. I know what my vision is. I know what the world looks like with me doing my thing. I know what effort I want to apply to that vision. And as events come rolling into my life, it makes it very easy to make decisions on whether or not I should engage. Imagine, if you will, that now at an organizational level. You have lots of projects coming in, you have a lot of resources, you got to spend a lot of time and money on stuff. when you have a very clear vision and mission, as I stated, those decisions become significantly easier to make. And because you have, real empirical data that allows you to make those decisions. And, saying no is probably one of the hardest answers out there for a lot of us. So that's another very, very good question.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's it for questions. So I want to thank you, Tom, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. You can visit cornerstone.com/lifesciences to learn more about our solutions. And this concludes our webinar. You may now disconnect.